Hey everybody, Dr. O'Neill again. Here's your Unit 3 exam review. It's going to be slightly different just because these chapters, this stuff is really covered well in all the videos that are required part of the course. So there's not a ton of new information. There is some, but I'm just going to kind of do it as more of a refresher for most of these areas, assuming that you already have gone through the videos. But and then there'll be a few areas where things are getting brought up here for the first time. All right, Chapter 5. What are the key functions of bone? They are support. So of course, it's the framework your body's built on. Protection, think rib cage, protecting your heart, etc. Your cranium, protecting your brain. Movement, we only move because muscles contract, but if they had nothing to originate from or insert on, we couldn't move. Blood cell formation is the one that people forget the most. You think about your bone marrow is where stem cells are churning out new white blood cells and red blood cells. And then mineral storage. Almost about 99% of the calcium in your body is going to be locked up in your bones and your teeth. So it's a mineral storage depot. Your bones are maybe 1/3 protein, 2/3 minerals, that kind of thing. Next, so you see, we're just kind of having more conversation. I didn't ask too many specific questions, just kind of like reminders for me of where this conversation I want it to go. Stem cells make blood cells in your bone marrow. So your bone, all of your blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and even the cells that become platelets, they come from what are called hematopoietic stem cells. So, and then they further break down into myeloid stem cells and lymphoid stem cells. Myeloid stem cells make your red blood cells. They make all the cells that become platelets, which are called megakaryocytes, and then they make all your white blood cells except for your lymphocytes. Your lymphoid stem cells make all your lymphocytes, but they all come from the same place originally. So it is stem cells that are constantly dividing and constantly churning out new blood cells in your bone marrow. When you're young, all your bone marrow is red for that reason. You're making a ton of new cells. As you get older, most of your bone marrow becomes yellow bone marrow, which is fat, which is why dogs like bones. They like bone marrow inside them, which is a fatty treat. Except the ends of your long bones still have red bone marrow, and like your flat bones, which is why if they're doing a bone marrow transplant or biopsy, they go into the ilium, they go into your pelvis, the few places where you still have red bone marrow. Okay, your bone cell types, I did a good video on this, but you've got, there's 4 bone cell types. I don't want to confuse you, but really there's 2. You have the osteogenic cells or the osteoprogenitor cells. Those are going to be bone stem cells. When you need new bone, those stem cells are going to become osteoblasts. How I remember it is blasts build bone. So an osteoprogenitor cell or a bone stem cell becomes an osteoblast that builds bone. Once that osteoblast has walled itself with bone around it, it actually becomes a mature bone cell called an osteocyte. So yes, there are technically 4 different bone cell types, but as you can see, 3 of them are just the same cell in different places. And actually, osteocytes can become osteoblasts again if they need to. Like if you have a fracture and you have to build new bone. So that's pretty cool. Then the 4th bone cell type is the osteoclast. Its job is to break down bone, which you might think is bad, but imagine like breaking up an old bridge to replace a new one. You have to break down old bone and replace it with better bone or your bones get real brittle. And also, remember that bones are a mineral storage depot. If you're not breaking down bone, then your blood calcium levels could get dangerously low and you could die. So your body is in this dance every day, this remodeling process where every day bone is recycled and replaced so that it can be healthier, but also your body will pull calcium and other minerals from your bones as needed to keep you alive. All right, ligaments versus tendons. So they're both examples of dense, regular connective tissue, but real quickly, ligaments connect a bone to a bone, tendons connect muscle to a bone. So cartilage versus bone, also very similar. They're, cartilage becomes bone, so actually your bones used to be cartilage. Here's the main difference. Cartilage is avascular, bone is vascular. So as you look at fracture repair and bone development, understand that as blood vessels show up, that allows cartilage to become bone. So that's the key difference to me. Cartilage is avascular and bone is vascular, meaning it has a blood supply. So bone development, very simple. It starts with these chondroblasts, these basically cells that can form cartilage, chondroblasts and chondrocytes. They lay down this hyaline cartilage framework. So your bones start as like this cartilage skeleton. And then as blood vessels show up, these ossification centers begin, and the osteoblast, the cells that build bone, are going to start to secrete osteoid, which builds bone, while ossifying this cartilage, turning into bone, while the cartilage is basically dissipating. So real simply, bone development is you start with a cartilage framework, blood vessels show up, and then cartilage is converted into bone, or bone is calcified and ossified. The growth plate's a real cool part of it, though. So whether you want to call it the epiphyseal cartilage, epiphyseal plate, growth plate, when you're young and your bones are still getting longer, you have a growth plate. And that is where cartilage is laid down. So you have a row of cartilage lays down, it becomes bone. Another row of cartilage lays down, it becomes bone. And that process happens as long as your bones are getting longer. Now, once that growth plate disappears, and that epiphyseal cartilage becomes what's called an epiphyseal line, and the ends of the bones have now fused to the shaft, the diaphysis of the bone. That bone will remodel and can change shape. If you start exercising, that bone can get thicker, but it can't get longer. Once the growth, so that's why when you're young, your bones are getting longer. As you get older, your bones will still remodel and can change shapes, and fractures can certainly be repaired, but your bones won't get longer. The big issue here is this is why if a kid gets a fracture, when you still have growth plates, we have to be very nervous when you have a fracture, because you have to make sure that the growth plate wasn't affected. If you can actually have a fracture that then dislocates the growth plate, and that can cause that bone to not grow as long as the other one. So you might have a leg length discrepancy, or one arm longer than the other. So that's why growth plates are very important, and you got to make sure you keep them safe to the best of your ability. Fracture repair is actually quite similar to the bone remodeling process and bone growth process. When you have a fracture, blood's going to show up. A cartilage framework is going to be laid down first to kind of wall off the area, and then osteoblasts are going to come in and turn that into bone. So we have cartilage, we have blood turning cartilage into bone. So it's real similar to the bone development process, which I've noted here. Osteoblasts turn cartilage into bone during fracture repair the same way they do during bone development. So osteoblasts are key players in both bone development and fracture repair. So you need osteoblasts. All right. What are the key hormones in bone cell function and bone health? We'll cover all the hormones in Chapter 13 at the bottom of this review, but you have three major hormones that play a role in bone cell function and bone health. PTH, which is parathyroid hormone, calcitriol, and calcitonin. So calcitriol I got out of the way first because it's kind of secondary, but calcitriol comes from the kidneys, and its job is to help parathyroid hormone. So when I talk about parathyroid hormone, just understand calcitriol does a lot of the same things. Calcitriol increases calcium absorption at the gut, and the reason it's at the kidneys is it increases reabsorption of calcium at the kidneys. So this is why, when you think about kidney stones have calcium in them, your body's trying to capture calcium before you urinate it out or micturate it out. And so your kidneys do play a role in maintaining blood calcium levels. This is actually why for years they put people with kidney stones on low calcium diets, because you saw the calcium in the kidneys and assumed that was the issue. But it was actually because by putting people on higher calcium diets, your body won't fight so hard to reabsorb that calcium, and it won't get trapped in your kidneys where it can form those stones. But the two major players, especially when you're young, are parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. So calcitonin comes from the thyroid gland. So you might not think of your thyroid gland with bone metabolism, but the main hormone that leads to the building of bone is calcitonin, and it's gonna tell your body to have more osteoblasts and build stronger bones. You have calcitonin is much more effective when you're young than when you're old, which is why it's easy to build bone when you're young. The rest of your life, you're just trying to basically preserve bone mass and slow bone loss. But so calcitonin is a secondary hormone from the thyroid gland, and it's the big bone builder. Parathyroid hormone comes from the parathyroid glands, usually four small paired or two groups of pairs of glands behind the thyroid gland. So their job is to make sure your blood calcium levels stay elevated. So if you don't have enough blood calcium, parathyroid hormone will have the osteoclast go and get it from your bones. So that sounds like it's always bad from a bone standpoint, but understand that osteoclasts are breaking down bones so it can be replaced and renewed as well. So it's not always a bad process, but those are the key hormones involved. Osteoblasts versus osteoclasts and bone health and diseases. So if you have plenty of calcium in your diet, you're very physically active, because your body's not going to build bone it doesn't need. That's why weight-bearing exercises and resistance exercises are so important. If you have more osteoblast function than osteoclast function, your bones are getting bigger and stronger and healthier. If you have more osteoclast function than osteoblast function, your bones are getting smaller and weaker. So when you think about like osteopenia, which means weak bones, or osteoporosis, which is a disease, which means that you have weak bones that have also affected your ability to function. That's when you have more osteoclast activity than osteoblast activity. If you're young and healthy, you want to see more osteoblast activity. You can certainly have too much of that, but generally speaking, our biggest concern is keeping our osteoclasts from being too busy. We want them recycling and repairing and renewing our bones, but we don't want our bones being weaker at the end of the day than when we started, or at the end of the month, end of the year, whatever. Your axial versus appendicular skeleton. So your skeleton, all the bones, your bones can be broken down into, your 206 bones can be broken down into two groups. The appendicular skeleton is your appendages. So that's going to be your arms and legs, but also your girdles, which I have here in a little bit. I'll answer it here now. So the pectoral girdle is your clavicle and scapula. They're not part of your arm. Your arm starts with the humerus, but they are the pectoral girdle. They're what hold your arm onto your body. So your appendicular skeleton is the part of your skeleton that's your limbs and the part that holds them on. The pelvic girdle is your three pelvic bones, which would be the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis, which make up what are called your coxal bones. They're not part of the leg, but they hold the leg onto your body. So that's your appendicular skeleton. Your trunk, so your head, your spinal column, your rib cage, those are down to your sacrum, your tailbone, those are your axial skeleton. So the axial skeleton is your kind of your core. The appendicular skeleton is your appendages plus those girdles that hold them on. What are the key bones? I mean, you have the human skeleton on a figure in your textbook. Hopefully you've been through the bone videos that I created, especially that kind of bone preview where I go through all of them. But I won't go through every bone in the body here, but you might hear like, oh my goodness, over 200 bones. But you have to understand that you have 12 pairs of ribs, so 24 ribs. Each hand, if you look at your wrist and hand, you've got your 14 phalanges and your 8 carpal bones. So you're already looking at 22 bones and then you have your 5 metacarpals. So you have 27 bones. So just to show you, 54 of your bones are hand bones, basically the same number of foot bones. There's not a ton of individual bones. So what I mean by this with key bones is humerus, radius, ulna, femur, tibia, fibula, those big ones like that. But if you've been through all the resources I gave you, you should definitely know the bones to the level you need it. Your vertebrae. So there are 7 cervical vertebrae. Those are the ones in your neck. Your cervical region is your neck. You have 12 thoracic vertebrae. Those are going to be the ones that have ribs attached to them. That's what your thoracic spine is. You have your 5 lumbar vertebrae. So we're at 27. It's 12. 24. So you have your 5 lumbar vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 7 cervical vertebrae. Then you have kind of your tailbone, the sacrum and coccyx, but which you can call them like sacral and coccygeal vertebrae, but generally we just think about the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. Then your discs, your intervertebral discs, those are fibrocartilage pads. Basically, think of them as shock absorbers that are absorbing the weight of your body as you go throughout your day. So if you were to go into space, you'd be almost 2 inches taller because those discs wouldn't have so much pressure on them. So that's your vertebrae and where they are, and your discs. And then we already talked about the girdles. So I would say really the key things here is know the bone cells, know how bones develop, and all the relationships there. And then know those key bones. But if you've been through the videos plus this little conversation we just have, you should be rock solid. All right, chapters. So what are the functions of your muscles? Now, when you think muscles, you should think movement. That's going to be your skeletal muscles. But of course, we have cardiac muscle that causes your heart to contract. Every organ has muscle because all your hollow organs have smooth muscle. So muscle plays a role in your blood vessels and everywhere else. But movement's a big part of it, whether it's moving material through your gut or out your anus when you defecate, or your skeletal muscles when you do bicep curls or pull-ups. But another a function of muscle, they play a big role in your metabolism. But a function of muscle we often forget is the generation of heat. Your muscles are extremely metabolically active, and you can shiver, and you can get goosebumps. So your muscles play a big role in generating heat. It's more your blood and your skin that regulate body heat. They function more like a radiator, but your muscles generate a ton of heat. That's why you get hot when you're working out. You go on a run when it's cold and you're freezing when you first start. Next thing you know, you're wishing you didn't bring so many clothes because you're getting so hot. Well, that's because muscles play a major role in the generation of heat. They also play a role in protecting us. You know, there's the thing about your abdomen. There's no rib cage around your abdomen. It's that muscular wall plays a big role of protection along with fat. They protect openings. That's what sphincters do. So those are a lot of the key functions. Sorry. So key muscles. You know, again, I have the muscles. I think there's 3 muscle videos I made for you. So the book does a good job. A real quick look at what the lats are, your biceps, your hamstrings, etc. So go through the book and go through the videos I made there for you. All right, origin versus insertion. So muscles have an origin and insertion. So the best way to look at this is the origin of a muscle is the attachment point that moves the least, and the insertion point is the attachment point that moves the most. Almost always the origin is more proximal. And what that means is, like on your limbs, proximal means closer to your trunk. So the origin of the muscle is usually going to be proximal, closer to your core, closer to your trunk. The insertion will be farther away. So, of course, you have some muscles that are only on your trunk, but that's a general good rule of thumb. But the best definition of an origin is the least movable part of a muscle attachment point, and the insertion is the attachment point that moves the most. All right, down to kind of the cellular level. Your thin and thick filaments are actin and myosin, and they actually form. So how muscles contract, and watch the videos on this, is actin and myosin link together and form a cross bridge, and then as the ATP, the cellular energy, is being used, it causes a power stroke. So your muscle fibers crawl over each other, and that's actually how muscles contract. So you don't have to know detailed information about muscle contraction, but that's a big picture. That's how when muscles contract, they usually get shorter, or at least with the contractions we think of usually, what are called concentric contractions. But it's that cross bridge formation that pulls the thin and thick filament over each other that leads to muscle contraction. So what is a motor unit? A motor unit is a motor nerve and all the muscle fibers it innervates. So muscles are controlled by nerves. So motor units can be different sizes. We have small motor units. They're going to just control, some only control like 3 or 4 muscle fibers. They play a big role in like fine movement, fine motor control. Then you have large motor units that might control 1,000 or more muscle fibers. They're all about generating power. So movement is a combination of these large motor units that generate tons of power and the small motor units that handle the details. Okay, and then we'll get into why that matters with this all-or-none principle at the end here. Neuromuscular junction and acetylcholine. So if motor nerves or control motors, muscles, when we get to the synapse, that's the neuromuscular junction, the end of a motor nerve, and the beginning of the muscle fibers. That neuromuscular junction is, so once that nerve fiber fires, which we'll cover in later chapters in this review here, it's going to send that electrical impulse to the synapse, the junction. That's going to release, and calcium is going to cause the release of neurotransmitters. Well, with muscles, it's always acetylcholine. There are lots of different neurotransmitters: epinephrine, norepinephrine, nitric oxide. There's tons of them. But acetylcholine is the only neurotransmitter that's used by muscles that we care about. So at the neuromuscular junction, at the synapse, acetylcholine will be released. That's what triggers this cascade of events that leads to muscle contraction. So you need acetylcholine to cause muscles to contract. That's why some diseases block acetylcholine, so muscles can't contract. Other diseases cause acetylcholine to be, so you can't get rid of acetylcholine, so muscles don't stop contracting. Think like tetanus there. But they all require energy too. Muscles cannot contract without ATP. So ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is the fuel or the cellular energy currency muscle fibers use, like all other cells. And without ATP, that cross bridge, the power stroke can't occur. ATP is needed every time actin and myosin form that power stroke and that cross bridge with each other. So since your muscle fibers are so metabolically active, they use tons of ATP, and that's where this kind of secondary fuel source, creatine phosphate, comes into play. If you just get up and just start sprinting and using all your muscles, I don't know, within 3 to 6 seconds you'd be out of ATP. Like at the most. Creatine phosphate comes along and it says, hey, you know what? So ATP has been turned into ADP, adenosine diphosphate. It's lost that third phosphate and lost energy. Well, creatine phosphate says, hey, you know what? I'll give you your third phosphate. I'll give you a third phosphate, and I'll give you the energy you need to attach that bond. So creatine phosphate's job is to recycle ADP back into ATP. Now, you don't have to know the details, but this is actually really cool why this works. Creatine phosphate can diffuse from where ATP is being used back to the mitochondria where it gets recycled 2,000 times faster, and it can diffuse back to where it's needed, about 7 times faster. I don't know why it's that wildly different, but it is. So your ATP can't diffuse back to the mitochondria, or ADP, sorry, can't diffuse back to the mitochondria, become ATP, and go back to where it's needed in time. So creatine phosphate goes back and forth, and recycles the ADP you do have. It's actually a really, really fascinating system. So just remember that creatine phosphate is needed. So if we don't have creatine phosphate, within 3 to 6 seconds we're out of ATP. With creatine phosphate, we can basically get like 10 to 15 seconds of muscle activity. After that, that's when your metabolism has to kick in. What I mean by that is, some glycolysis, but then also the rest of your aerobic respiration, which is, the conversion of ATP. So then you're out of stored ATP. Now it's time to make it. And that's where lactic acid comes into play. So the next question, when does lactic acid become an issue during muscle metabolism? If your muscles are pushing harder than you can, right, above kind of your level of fitness or at a real high intensity, you're not going to be able to have enough oxygen to cause the full metabolism of all the fuel that you're using, whether it's glucose or fat or something else. So if there's not enough oxygen, after glycolysis generates ATP, some of it's going to become lactic acid. So if you're pushing harder than the amount of oxygen you have allows, that's when lactic acid becomes an issue. All right, some terminology here: isotonic versus isometric contractions. So an isotonic contraction means the same tension. So isotonic contractions are a muscle contraction where there is movement. The muscle is going to be either getting longer or shorter. If you want to break those down, a concentric contraction would be a muscle contracting and getting shorter. An eccentric contraction would be a muscle contracting and getting longer. I hope you're watching, you have to for the class anyways, but I hope you're watching the videos. They'll go into more detail. Isometric means same length. So an isometric contraction is muscles are contracting, but there's no change in length. So if you're just standing up, you're standing still, right? If you're standing still, think of all the muscles that are contracting so you don't just fall over. So your postural muscles are all isometric. They're contracting, but you're not moving. There's no change in length. That's an isometric contraction. Fast twitch versus slow twitch fibers. So there's actually a range of these, but on the far end of the spectrums, we have a slow twitch fiber, which is, it's not powerful. It's a small diameter, but it's endurance. They can make a lot of ATP. They got tons of blood supply. So your slow twitch fibers, think endurance. They're not very strong, but they'll work for a long period of time. Your fat, so like think about your postural muscles again. You can stand for 10 hours straight if you have to. Those muscles just keep churning along. Fast twitch fibers, so muscles that are dominated by fast twitch fibers, they're going to be very powerful and explosive, but they're going to run out of fuel fast. So you can't do push-ups all day. You can stand all day because those postural muscles are primarily made of slow twitch fibers. Your pecs, your chest, and your triceps, those are what are called phasic or more explosive muscles. They can generate tons of power, but they run out of fuel quickly, and that's because they're dominated by your quick twitch or fast twitch fibers. Last point for this chapter: the all or none principle and recruitment. So a muscle fiber and a motor nerve, for example, nerves and muscles both are all or none principle. Think of a gun. If you pull a trigger hard enough, the gun's going to fire as fast as it can. If you pull a trigger slowly, the bullet doesn't come out slower. So all or none means there's a strong enough stimulus to make me do my job, and I'll do it at 100%, or I won't do it at all or none. So in this case, an individual muscle fiber follows this process. So if I lift a 10-pound weight and then sit it down, lift a 100-pound weight, I can't tell my muscle fibers to work 10 times harder. That's where recruitment comes into play. If I can't ask my individual muscle fibers to work harder, I have to recruit more muscle fibers. So for me to pick up a 100-pound weight, more larger motor units and more muscle fibers are being used. I can't ask a muscle fiber to work any harder. So that's the point of the all or none principle. Okay. So yeah, big stuff there. I mean, the basics of the muscle metabolism and muscle contraction. Understanding the key muscles are the big ones there. All right. Chapter 11. Let me get a drink here. There's a lot of stuff going on here, which you can tell by the decent sized list here, but really the number of videos we use. So just some basic terms to get us started. CNS versus PNS. That's your central nervous system versus your peripheral nervous system. So simply put, your central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system, everything else. Sensory nerves, motor nerves, receptors, effectors, all of that. Sensory versus motor division, you may see terms like, another term for sensory is afferent, which means towards, and the motor division is efferent, which means away. So remember, your sensory nerves are going to carry information towards your brain and spinal cord, so you can do something with the information. Your motor nerves are going to carry signals away from your brain and spinal cord, so you can physically do something. So sensory nerves send information to your brain and spinal cord. Motor nerves is how your body reacts to that. That's kind of this reflex arc down here. We have a receptor, which is going to sense something in the environment. It's going to be attached to a sensory nerve, which tells your brain or spinal cord something. Then there's going to be this process of information processing. We decide what to do. It might be a reflex, might be unconscious, but we decide what to do with the information. Then we use a motor nerve to send information away from your brain and spinal cord to an effector that says to do something, which might be to change the diameter of your pupil, might be a knee-jerk reflex, whatever it is. That's that reflex arc. Next set of terms, somatic versus autonomic. So somatic means body. So you think somatic nervous system, think skeletal muscle. The control of your skeletal muscle is somatic. Autonomic is everything else. So your autonomic nervous system controls cardiac muscle, your heart, smooth muscle in hollow organs, glands, and fat. You might not think of your fat being controlled by your nervous system, but it is. So somatic nervous system, think movement and skeletal muscle. Somatic meaning body. Autonomic basically means automatic, subconscious. So your autonomic division, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glands, and fat. Okay. Next, now we're getting into like how an individual nerve does its job. The sodium-potassium exchange pump function and the resting membrane potential. So the sodium-potassium exchange pump is the most important example of, active transport that occurs in the human body. So active transport requires energy. So every time that the sodium-potassium exchange pump works, 3 sodium ions are being pulled out of this neuron and 2 potassiums are being brought in, which means that you're pulling osmotically, you're pulling something out of the cell, and as you're doing so, you're pulling out one more positive ion than you add in. So you're changing the polarity, or you're changing the charge, and that's what leads to the resting membrane potential. So when a nerve is sitting there and it's poised to fire, it's a loaded gun, it's because the sodium-potassium exchange pump has pulled 3 sodiums out of that nerve and only deposited 2 potassiums. So you pulled out 3 Na pluses and deposited 2 K pluses. So that leads to our resting membrane potential, which is generally going to be right around negative 70 millivolts. Then we have depolarization. So how this process works, I'll go through depolarization and repolarization. So there's a stimulus that triggers a nerve to fire. And what happens, real simply put, depolarization, sodium rushing into a neuron depolarizes it. And it causes the charge to go up to, let's say, positive 30. And when you get to positive 30 millivolts, what happens is those sodium channels slam shut, so no more sodium's coming in, and the potassium channels open. So now repolarization is potassium rushing out of a cell. So don't overthink this. Sodium rushing into a neuron causes depolarization, the nerve to fire, to be turned on. Turning that nerve off is repolarization, potassium rushing out of that neuron. But here's the key difference. When you get from positive 30 millivolts back to negative 70, potassium channels close slowly. Think about like a castle gate closing slowly, and people are still sneaking in while it's closing, but it's not closed all the way. That's what I see in my head. So you don't just stop at negative 70. So you don't just have depolarization and repolarization. You actually have the resting potential is going to dip down to let's say negative 90 millivolts. So that's called hyperpolarization. And so now that you don't have to know the details, but that's what makes it so the nerves only fire in one direction because of something called the refractory period. But just remember, depolarization, sodium rushing into a nerve; repolarization, potassium rushing out. But that difference is what allows nerves to function properly. If nerves fired both directions, we would have serious problems. Imagine you have you don't need motor information being sent towards your brain. You don't need sensor information being sent towards your fingers. So that's why nerves are one way. All right. Let's see. Resting potential, depolarization. We covered all that. What is myelin and why is it valuable? So myelin is the fatty insulation around nerves, around many of your nerves, and what it does is it it decreases the resistance in your nerves. So when you myelinate a nerve, it's going to send a signal much faster. So the example I like to use is the disease multiple sclerosis, or MS. MS is an autoimmune disease that destroys this myelin sheath. The nerves are fine. So you see all the problems somebody has with MS is because their nerves have lost their myelin. So it's an insulation that allows your nerves to function better. So, all right. So key neuroglial cells, you don't, for this level of class, we don't go into massive detail, but hopefully you watch the video on the neuroglial cells. So as far as what they are, neuroglia basically means nerve glue, and these are support cells. They help your nerves. So your nervous system is made of neurons, the actual cells that send and receive electrical impulses, and the neuroglial cells. And these neuroglial cells are the support cells. So you have like astrocytes. They create like the three-dimensional framework where your nerves function. But from what I could see in this book and this course, the key neuroglial cells, so there's several, but you have your Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes. So these are the two cell types that create myelin sheaths, that wrap your cells in myelin. The key difference is oligodendrocytes, they do it at the level of the central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord. The Schwann cells do it at the level of the peripheral nervous system, your sensory and motor nerves. So like I said, there are other neuroglial cells. The video covered those, like microglia is one of my favorite. But the astrocytes are my real favorite because we always talk about how neurons need glucose as a fuel source. Well, it's not really true. Like we talk about your brain needing glucose. About 30% of your brain cells, primarily your astrocytes, they fuel on glucose and they turn it into lactate. And lactate is actually the fuel that your neurons primarily like. I mean, they can use glucose, but so one of the main functions of astrocytes is to take your sugar from your blood, turn it into lactate, and feed that to your neurons. I find that so fascinating. So, all right. What happens at a synapse? So the synapse is the space. Remember, your nerves, they send and receive electrical impulses. Well, they're not connected, right? So synapses are going to be between one nerve and another, or a nerve and whatever the effector is, a muscle or gland or something. So the synapse is this gap between the nerve and whatever it's communicating with. This is where the electrical signal becomes chemical. So it actually synapses are full of chemicals called neurotransmitters that send the signal across that space. That's pretty cool. So, all right, we covered the reflex arc. Sympathetic versus parasympathetic division functions. So these are the two divisions of your autonomic system, which was covered up here, are sympathetic and parasympathetic. So sympathetic, you've probably heard fight or flight. It's actually fight, flight, or freeze is probably the better way to say it, because some of us and some organisms freeze. I've been using that term a lot more recently because I think that's a big part of test anxiety. But so the sympathetic division is excitatory. It's all about mobilizing energy. So heart rate's going to go up, blood pressure. So think about if you were going to get up and run, if you were running from an animal, like a bear that wanted to kill you, what would you expect to happen in your body? You're not going to worry about digestion right now. It's going to be fuel to your muscles, fuel to your heart. Your brain's going to be firing on all cylinders because you're trying to escape. This is legit. So it's excitatory. Your parasympathetic division, you might hear it called rest and digest, rest and repose, these kind of things. It's inhibitory, relaxing. So kind of like that yin-yang, that balance. We're supposed to have a balance between sympathetic activity, excitement, parasympathetic regeneration and relaxation. So the reason stress is such a killer for the modern human is we're far from balance. We're stressed most of our lives, most of the day, etc. All right, next, now we're getting into different parts of the brain. So I generally don't use these terms, which is why I want to bring them up on the review. But you could break the brain down. I like to break the brain down a little differently than this, which I'll do in following points. But this textbook really shows that the brain is broken down into the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. So, and again, there's nothing wrong with this. The forebrain would be your cerebrum and your thalamus. So this is going to be where like conscious thoughts come from, how we respond, more complex behaviors, how we respond to our environment. Your forebrain is really where we're different than other animals because we have this massive cerebrum. I like to say that, we of course we have opposable thumbs and those kind of things, but we can predict the future with our so your cerebrum is where conscious thought occurs, but also we can predict the future. So we're not psychic, but we understand the outcomes of our actions. We learn from our mistakes. We're way less, we still are instinctual, but we're not driven by instinct near as much, especially as we get older. That's what comes with getting older and maturity and experience, is we can predict the future. We know that walking into a busy street is dangerous. We can predict the outcomes of that action. So that's what I mean when I say we can predict the future. But the forebrain is definitely where humans are different than really all other animals. Then we have the midbrain. This is going to be right below the thalamus, like the level of the hypothalamus. So kind of coordination, responding to things like sights and sounds. They're going to come from that midbrain area. Then the hindbrain is going to be, so your midbrain is part of your brainstem, which is how I break it down. So like visual and auditory reflexes, that type of stuff. And then we have the hindbrain, which is the pons and medulla oblongata, the other two parts of the brainstem, with the cerebellum. So that's going to be coordination from the physical coordination from the cerebellum, but then also like basic life support functions. So I just want you to have a basic overview of those three terms because they, the book made a big deal out of them. But here's how I break the brain down. We have the brainstem. So you have the midbrain, or also known as the mesencephalon, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So starting at the bottom, the lower a function is in this pathway in your brain, the more important it is to survival, less important it is to being human. So what I mean by that is what happens at your cerebrum makes you human. What happens at your brainstem just keeps you alive. So your medulla oblongata, think basic life support functions, cardiovascular functions, digestive functions, the respiratory, like rhythmicity centers, so like breathe in, breathe out, that all happens here at the medulla oblongata. The pons, the key thing there is the connection between the cerebellum and the rest of your nervous system, and then also your respiratory rate centers are in the pons. So that's where you get signals based on basically pH and carbon dioxide levels that tell you breathe faster or breathe slower. Then we have the midbrain. I'd say the midbrain or mesencephalon, the two key things here are, number one, the maintenance of consciousness. So the fact that you're awake is because signals are being sent through an area here in the midbrain called the reticular formation. And the other big one is visual and auditory reflexes. So I don't mean hearing and seeing, but when something moves in the corner of your eye, you look at it. When you hear a loud noise, you either go into the fetal position or look at it. Those are basic visual and auditory reflexes. You do that the same way a goose would do that. So kind of, again, more basic life support, not the complex vision we have versus other animals, not recognizing what we hear, but just these basic visual and auditory reflexes. Cerebellum, think three words: balance, posture, coordination. The cerebellum learns through trial and error. You're better at moving through the world than you were when you were a toddler. It's actually called a toddler because that weird walking that young kids do is called toddling. So toddlers are still learning. Or let's say you play the piano or the guitar or play baseball. You used to suck at it and now you don't. And a big part of that is because the muscle memory that happens at the cerebellum. So yes, basic balance and posture, but coordination. So a good example of what the cerebellum does is to see what happens when it doesn't work. So there are diseases that cause cerebellar ataxia, but so is getting drunk. So you ever seen someone drunk, or if a police officer is doing a field sobriety test, they're looking for this transient cerebellar ataxia. You can't touch your finger to your nose, can't walk in a straight line. Your cerebellum is basically numb from all the alcohol. So that's what the cerebellum does. The cerebrum and then the corpus callosum, some would say callosum. The corpus callosum is just this massive connection between the two halves of the brain. So I wanted to mention that just because it does connect the two cerebral hemispheres, the left and right one. But cerebrum, think consciousness, like conscious thought and predicting the future and all the higher mental functions, memory and language, all those complex things that we do as humans that a lizard might not be able to do is because of our massive cerebrum. Last structure here of the brain, we have the hypothalamus. I put here as the link between the nervous and endocrine system. So in a word, what the hypothalamus does is helps your body maintain homeostasis, that stable internal environment we covered back in chapter 1. So if you need water, your hypothalamus makes you thirsty. If you need food, your hypothalamus makes you hungry. If you have gametes, your hypothalamus tells you to have sex to reproduce. These kind of things. So like your urges and drives come from the hypothalamus. Well, there's other things too, like your core body temp, your basic body temperature control is going to be here, and these kind of things too. But what I like to say about the hypothalamus, if you want to know what it does, it's what willpower fights. If you don't want to do something, but your brain is telling you to, like if you're addicted to cigarettes or something, the hypothalamus is where those urges and drives come from. So some are certainly good, thirst centers and hunger centers and sexual pursuit area of the brain. that kind of thing. But this can certainly go out of whack if you're on a diet and your brain's like, no, I'm telling you to eat. Well, it's the hypothalamus doing that. But what I mentioned here is the hypothalamus is the link between the nervous and endocrine systems. So we'll cover the endocrine system in the last chapter of this review. But and that's because the hypothalamus actually makes hormones. It makes what are called regulatory hormones that tell the pituitary gland what to do. So the pituitary gland is called this master gland of your endocrine system, but the hypothalamus bosses it around. Also, the hypothalamus makes the two hormones that are stored in the back half of the pituitary gland, that posterior pituitary, that is antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. We'll cover them in 2 chapters. But so that's why I call it this link between your nervous system and your endocrine systems. Okay, next chapter, chapter 12. This is, just again, there's videos on each of these topics. I just kind of have them listed here like your different senses, but there's not a ton you have to know from this chapter as much as the other ones. But first, just different types of senses, general versus special senses. There are lots of senses, as you can see from the receptors here. How I look at it is just know your special senses, all the rest are general senses. So taste and smell, vision, hearing, and equilibrium. Those are your special senses. So taste, smell, hearing, vision, and balance and equilibrium. Those are your special senses. Everything else, so like pressure and vibration and these kind of things, pain, these are examples of general senses. I would say the one that's the most confusing is proprioception, because proprioception seems kind of advanced, but it is an example of a general sense. I'll cover it in this next list here. So just know your special senses. Every other type of sensation is general. All right, so different receptor types. Nociceptors, these are going to be pain receptors. Thermoreceptors, they monitor temperature, so they tell what your body temperature is and respond. If your core temperature goes up, they find ways to cool you off, etc. Chemoreceptors, they monitor chemicals. This would be like taste and smell, both use chemoreceptors, which is why in order to taste and smell something, it has to be dissolved first. So if your nose is really dry, you'll have trouble smelling, but also if your sinuses are all plugged up, you'll have trouble tasting as well. That's because those are chemoreceptors. There are also receptors in your blood vessels that they're like basically pH meters. They look at carbon dioxide levels. Those are chemoreceptors. Baroreceptors are pressure receptors, so they measure pressure or tension. Or I should say when you've had massive meals in the past, have literally stretched your stomach, those are baroreceptors that are telling you, man, if I eat any more, I'm going to barf. So there are also baroreceptors, basically like internal blood pressure cuffs in your arteries as well. Mechanoreceptors, they're going to monitor like physical changes. That's when I said like vibration, fine touch, crude touch, pressure. Those are all examples of physical reception. Proprioceptors, which are a type of mechanoreceptors, they're called joint position awareness receptors. This is a purely somatic sensation, which means that when I close my eyes, I know where my right pinky finger and my right small toe is, but I don't know where my spleen is. So you only feel like your physical body with proprioception, but it tells you where you are in space. Now, I teach sports medicine classes and coaching classes, and I talk about those a lot more because obviously athletes are moving their body through space. But those are proprioceptors. Then we have photoreceptors. They're going to measure things like light, and they're involved in vision. The process of adaptation. So adaptation is when a receptor can get used to a response. So which type of receptors are more likely to demonstrate adaptation and which are less likely to do so or won't do it at all? So we have different types of receptors. We have they're called phasic and tonic receptors. Phasic receptors only respond to changes. So like temperature receptors. They notice when the temperature changes around you, but they're not constantly telling you what the temperature is. If you go into a room that's slightly warmer or cooler than you're used to, you'll notice it for a while, but you get used to it. That's adaptation. Smell's the biggest one. You walk into a room, whether it smells really good or really bad, you get used to smells very quickly. That's why, I used to work in the meat department. I'd come home and the dog would freak out by what I smelled like, or other people would notice what I smelled like, but I never noticed it. Or when I was in graduate school and working with human cadavers, I'd go to Subway and people look at you funny because you reek like formaldehyde, but you haven't the slightest idea that you do. So you get used to smells real easily. So those are the kind of receptors that do have adaptation. They do change, but these tonic receptors are always on. As long as the stimulus is there, you're going to feel it. So there's not going to be as much adaptation. Pain's a good example there. You can block pain, numb pain. You can try to keep it out of your mind, But as long as there's an injury in your ankle, it's going to be telling your brain there's an injury there. So pain is like the least likely. I guess you could say like photoreceptors, like there is some adaptation. You can get used to light that's a little too bright and those kind of things. But your eyes, the receptors in your eyes don't quit working, or else all of a sudden you wouldn't see. So there are some receptors that are just always doing their job. Some are. It takes a lot to get them to stop doing their job, to kind of adapt to this new environment, and some are going to respond really quickly, and that's like your temperature receptors or taste receptors. So watch all the videos here on how taste and smell and hearing, balance and vision and all that work. I definitely want you to know the structures of the eye. I won't go through it here because the eye structure video covers it all. But just quick things, just to kind of tie a bow around this. Taste and smell, like I mentioned, they both use chemoreceptors. So you can't taste or smell something unless it's dissolved in liquid. That's why there's saliva in your mouth and mucus in your nose and in your nasal cavity. Hearing and then balance and equilibrium, hearing and balance, they both use your inner ear, but their hearing involves the cochlea, whereas balance involves like the ampulla, the saccule and utricles and the semicircular canals, all terms you can get from those videos. But so they both use the inner ear, but separate places. And then vision, of course, would be one of your cranial nerves, the optic nerve, and make sure you know the structures of the eye from that video. All right, this one I wanted to add just because it's kind of neat. What is the blind spot? So it's actually called the optic disc. You have a blind, so what causes it is this optic disc at the back of your eye. That's where the optic nerve exits the eye. So since the signals have to be sent through that nerve, there's no photoreceptors. There's no rods or cones laying on this little area called the optic disc. That's what causes it. But then the reason why I want to chat about this, do we really have one as humans? So each eye has a blind spot, but you don't, right? That's because you have binocular vision. You have two eyes, and the blind spots don't overlap. So there's not like an area right now you can't see with both eyes. But if you close one eye, that's not true. So individual eyeballs have a blind spot, but as a human, with two eyes, I would say that we don't. The other reason we need two eyes, so it gets rid of our blind spot problem, but the other reason we have two eyes is for depth perception. So if you only have one eye, depth perception is very difficult. Like a few years ago, a basketball player at Baylor only had one eye because of a disease he had. I think he has Marfan's, I can't remember, but he only had one eye. The fact that you could be an elite college basketball player without the depth perception that comes with two eyes is just shocking to me. So really cool example. All right, then your actual photoreceptors, and just quickly, I will say there are three. There's rods and cones, but we do have light receptors in our eye that tell us if it's light or dark out. I'm sure you've heard about, how when it's light out, your brain says it's time to be awake, and when it's dark, it's time to go to bed. They have found those receptors. There are photoreceptors that tell your pineal gland or pineal gland whether or not you should be making melatonin. That's why we're supposed to be awake when the sun is out, and we're supposed to be asleep when it's dark. But we won't worry about those. But rods and cones are both photoreceptors. Let me kind of run you through these. Rods are like not color vision. They're like black and white vision. They're involved in peripheral vision because they're all over the place. So they can see in the periphery, but they're not very good, right? They're fuzzy. They don't distinguish color well, but their key is the peripheral vision, and the second thing, so they help you with peripheral vision. And number two, they don't need as much light. So in low light environments, rods are the only ones that are going to work. Cones are great. They're detailed. They see in brilliant color, but they're concentrated. They're only in the center of the back of the eye, and they need a lot of light. So if you want to see things in detail, I think you guys know this, but you look right at it. That way, that what you're looking at strikes the cones. You have plenty of light, and then that's fine. So you can see things great if you're looking at it and there's plenty of light. But in your periphery and in low light environments, the rods take over. So they're not as good of photoreceptors, but they'll save your life, in those environments. Whether you need to see things in your periphery or in low light environments. Okay, last chapter here for this unit is chapter 13 on the endocrine system. So first, just we'll cover the key hormones here, and like before, there's plenty of videos in this area, so I just want to tie this up. But what is a hormone versus a neurotransmitter? So I mentioned a neurotransmitter earlier. They can be the exact same chemical. The key is where. Hormones are going to be in your bloodstream. Neurotransmitters are in synapses. So like, for example, epinephrine or adrenaline is both. It's just a matter of where. So the endocrine system controls your hormones. So another terminology set here, endocrine versus exocrine glands. So we're dealing with endocrine glands here, like your digestive glands, and other ones are exocrine glands. So endocrine glands are going to dump their secretions into your bodily fluids. So think into your blood. Endocrine glands produce hormones in your blood that get into your blood. Exocrine glands are going to dump their secretions onto surfaces. So this will be your digestive glands that are dumping their secretions into your gut, or like the skin glands that dump secretions onto your surfaces. So endocrine glands, think into your body fluids. Exocrine glands, out of, think on surfaces. The other big difference is exocrine glands use ducts. All right, how does the endocrine system work with the nervous system? Who's really in charge? We kind of already covered this, right? The nervous system produces these regulatory hormones from the hypothalamus that tell your master gland, the pituitary, what to do. So the nervous system and endocrine system work together. So think of it this way. Nervous system, it works real quickly. The responses are super quick, but they go away real fast. Endocrine glands endocrine system works slow, but the responses last a long time. So like second by second survival is primarily controlled by your nervous system. Long-term things like growth, development, reproduction, they're going to be controlled by your endocrine system. But the nervous system is really in charge because it tells your endocrine system what to do. All right, the hypothalamus and pituitary, they communicate with each other. So the hypothalamus is part of your nervous system, but because of those regulatory hormones, it tells your pituitary gland what to do. Then the pituitary gland tells the rest of your endocrine system what to do. All right, let's break that down. Anterior versus posterior pituitary gland. So the anterior pituitary gland is the hormones are actually made there and secreted from there. The posterior pituitary gland are going to be the two hormones I've already mentioned, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, that are produced in the hypothalamus and just stored and then secreted from the posterior pituitary. So the the next point is all key hormones. That's why this is so short, but I'll walk you through all the big ones. So the hypothalamus, we already mentioned the releasing hormones, the regulatory hormones that tell the pituitary what to do. So the pituitary, again, the videos cover all this, but we have adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, that tells the adrenal cortex to release its secretions, things like cortisol, aldosterone, and adrenaline. Thyroid stimulating hormone, I'm just looking at the figure from the book. Thyroid stimulating hormone tells the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, those are the ones that tell your gonads what to do. If you're a man, follicle stimulating hormone helps with the maturation of sperm. Luteinizing hormone, it tells your gonads to make testosterone. If you're a female, follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the follicle, which is where the egg's going to be, and it also increases estrogen levels. Luteinizing hormone, a spike in luteinizing hormone is actually what causes ovulation, and then luteinizing hormone is going to lead to an increase in progesterone. So that's why if you're going to get pregnant, you need, in that second half of the cycle, after the egg's been fertilized, you need progesterone. So follicle stimulating hormone dominates the first half of the woman ovarian and uterine cycles, and luteinizing hormone dominates the second half. Prolactin leads to the development of mammary glands and the production of breast milk. Growth hormone leads to growth. It does two key things. Increases protein synthesis, so if you're going to grow, you need more proteins. And it tells your body to use fat as fuel more. That's why people with high growth hormone levels are going to be bigger, but also be leaner usually. ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, like the name implies, it opens channels in the kidneys that say, it's an antidiuretic. It says produce less urine. So you're going to reabsorb more water under the influence of antidiuretic hormone. So a good example there is if you're drinking, alcohol actually stops the secretion of ADH, which is why alcohol is such an unbelievably powerful diuretic. If you drink 4 beers, you're going to pee out a 6-pack for that reason. Excuse me there. Let's see, and then oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to cause contraction of the mammary glands for breast milk release, and then also contraction of the uterus for labor and delivery. Next, adrenal glands, you have cortisol. Cortisol is your stress hormone. It's all about mobilizing energy because, for that fight or flight response. So your blood sugar is going to go up, etc. And aldosterone. Aldosterone tells the kidneys to reabsorb less or reabsorb sodium, and then osmosis says that water will follow that sodium back into your body. So aldosterone works with ADH to keep fluid in your body. That's the adrenal cortex. The adrenal medulla, you have epinephrine and norepinephrine. That's adrenaline and noradrenaline. So they play a role in the stress response, but that's where like epinephrine is going to cause blood pressure to go up and these kind of things. Norepinephrine is going to be where that mental clarity comes from when you're under stress. Like if you're in a really stressful environment, it almost feels like time slows down. Well, it's because you're thinking so clearly and your brain is just rocking at a higher speed that it feels that way. So this last question on the page here, your adrenal medulla is an extension of the blank division of your ANS. Your ANS is autonomic nervous system, and it's the sympathetic division. So your adrenal medulla functions as part of that fight or flight system. In the kidneys, just going through here, erythropoietin, that's going to tell your bone marrow to make more blood cells. Now, your kidneys care about that because more blood cells will increase blood volume, and your kidneys need you to have a good high blood pressure. Now, not hypertension, that's a modern disease, but your kidneys are very concerned about your blood pressure. Excuse me. And that's where renin comes in too. The hormone renin, it starts a process called the renin-angiotensin pathway, which leads to an increase in blood pressure. So both hormones from the kidneys that we're talking about here, their job is to keep your blood pressure up. So now in the modern human, we have too much high blood pressure. The drugs actually used stops renin from working, stops that process. Now then we have at the bottom of this image I'm looking at, ovaries versus testes. Those are the female and male gametes. So estrogen and progesterone are your female sex hormones. Testosterone is the primary male sex hormone, or androgen. Cover that in that reproductive system chapter. On the top of the next, you have the pineal gland. You got melatonin. It plays a role in your circadian rhythms, or your sleep-wake cycles, your day-night cycles, whatever you want to call that. Thyroid glands, you have thyroxine is T4. Triiodothyronine is T3. Those are your two thyroid hormones that regulate your metabolism and energy usage. Calcitonin, as we covered earlier, plays a role in building up bone, especially when you're young. Your parathyroid glands produce parathyroid hormone. Their job is to make sure your blood calcium levels stay high enough. Thymus gland produces thymosin and thymopoietin. Those two compounds, they help with the maturation of your immune system. You probably have heard of T cells. T cells are called T cells because they're thymus dependent. The heart produces atrial natriuretic peptide. There's a second one called brain natriuretic peptide that comes from the heart. But if your heart is being overstretched, natriuretic, think natural diuretic. If your heart is being overstretched, this weak hormone will tell your kidneys to get rid of water. Now we know it doesn't work very well because we have so many modern humans that have high blood pressure. But that's what it's supposed to do. Next, your stomach. There are other hormones. I'm just going off this little list here. Your stomach produces gastrin. That plays a role in the release of stomach acid and motility and those kind of things. Pancreas, you've got glucagon, insulin, and somatostatin. Their primary role is the control of blood sugar. So insulin lowers blood sugar and glucagon raises it. But it's a lot more than that, right? Like insulin is actually a nutrient sensor, so it does play a role in it's. I like to call insulin an anabolic storage hormone, like a growth promoter, not just a blood sugar regulator. So speaking of that, somatostatin, another name for this would be growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So when you have a lot of insulin, it tells your body to grow. Now, whether that's muscle or fat depends on a lot of things. And if you don't have a lot of insulin, then your body will go more into like a recycling and repair phase than a growth phase. Then let's see, intestinal hormones, we have secretin and cholecystokinin. Again, they're major players in the digestive process, but cholecystokinin is also called CCK. That one is a major player because it tells the pancreas and the liver and gallbladder to dump their secretions during digestion. So if you don't have enough cholecystokinin, then you won't have all the chemicals you need to properly digest your food. Okay, so that is the Unit 3 review. I hope this is helpful. I hope you crush this test, and I'm here if you need me. Go for it.